Operation Domination is underway. The ultimate game plan to dominate your NFL experience. With your hosts, Dan Maven.
But what's more impressive to me about the
Chase Thornton.
Yeah, I mean, I got it.
Chris Godwin.
Get him, Chase.
And Adam.
No,
LaRue.
not necessarily, but it's again the same.
Don't hope to win. Be great and dominate.
Let's dive into these wide receivers. Michael Pittman off the top, the volume gobbler himself. Chris, you have him at wide receiver 20. We all have him as a wide receiver too. Some of us have the mid-level. You have more of a lower end. You look at Michael Pittman, and why do you have him maybe a little bit lower than ADP consensus right now?
I think, Anthony talked about earlier in the show, some of the guys that were injured at the quarterback position. I look at some of the guys who are injured at the receiver position, and I start filling in some of those gaps and some of the guys that I think will slide in ahead of Michael Pittman. I think that the added weapons, isn't necessarily going to hurt Pittman because I don't think Richardson can make multiple reads, but I do think there'll be an effort to try to involve other guys, and as a result, could hurt his targets in that kind of, that way. I think Michael Pittman could be a guy who wins the league for you if Joe Flacco is the quarterback for this team by the end of the season. But other than that, Michael Pittman, I think, is a guy that has a limited upside, who has a very consistent floor, but kind of reminds me of Keenan Allen a couple of years ago, before he became that, was always getting you that solid floor, but never really that high ceiling. So you got the average games, you got a touchdown here, you got 70 yards, you had to kind of depend on the 6 or 7 catches. Michael Pittman's upside to me is my concern, Dan. I think there's a lot of guys here that are going to kind of be pigeonholed to be those stretch the field guys with, Pierce, with Downs, with Mitchell. So what does this kind of leave his reality people that's underneath stuff? I think he's really good at that, but I have some concerns that they're going to, not be able to feature him enough to be a guy I trust in my lineup as a stronger receiver 2 option.
The upside part, I do agree with. I mean, that's been Pittman's downfalls. He doesn't score touchdowns, right? The most he's ever had in a season is 6. He had 4 last year, even though he had 150 targets, and they weren't necessarily going to a lot of other guys. And we know he doesn't get necessarily the big plays with it. I do think it's nice, though, to know that if Richardson does go down on their injury, we actually like him with the backup quarterback. So I think that does play a little bit well here as far as his floor goes. I think when you're taking Pittman, you're taking a guy that I want that wide receiver 2 floor. Maybe that's not necessarily as exciting as some other guys who maybe have some more upside, but I don't worry about the volume. I mean, especially while Richardson's the quarterback, people are like goo goo gaga over Josh Downs. I'm like, you're talking about the guy who's wide receiver like 75 when Richardson was playing, only was getting a 15% target share. When Richardson was playing, like it was all Pittman all day long and nobody else. So, Anthony, do you think Pittman's ever going to get to that point where he has that upside? Like, what is it about the touchdowns? It doesn't seem to matter what the quarterback is. I don't get it.
Look who we share as an offense with when you have Jonathan Taylor there. In the red zone, Taylor's probably going to absorb a lot of those red zone opportunities, and now we have Anthony Richardson. I like Michael Pittman a lot. I'm okay. Like, not everybody can have a wide receiver 1 ceiling. Not everybody can be a top 5 receiver. I think Michael Pittman being a high floor guy and drafting him where we are, I don't mind it. But we also have to remember this Steichen offense, what he managed to do in Philadelphia with a running quarterback like Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts still threw the hell out of the football. A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith were still monsters as receivers. So I think there's some, we're drafting Pittman for his floor, but I think there's hidden ceiling in there. And that's all relegated, or not relegated, but that's all dependent on when and if Anthony Richardson develops as a passer, because we already know what he can do as a runner. If he starts clicking as a passer and with these weapons and even Jonathan Taylor, like we're looking at a potential top 10 offense.
Yeah. I Adam loves to hear that down there. I'm sure he does.
I mean, that's just, we don't even know what Mitchell is yet.
Yeah.
One super,
Alex Pierce part 2.
Special offense.
What'd you say, Chris?
Chase just hates
part 2.
Yeah.
You mean the way he's going to utilize, right? Not from a talent perspective. Yeah. Okay. So we definitely like them a hell of a lot more.
One super brief thing on the red zone topic with Pittman. Super brief. Just he's never had a quarterback with any zip at all in the red zone. So for a guy that isn't a big separator, I think that does matter quite a bit. Not to say that he's going to suddenly be a 12 touchdown guy, but to get above 4 or 5, like I think there's definitely room to tack on a couple extra if you have a little more zip, whether that's Flacco or Richardson.
Yeah, and the dude was he was wide receiver 15 last season. No, the only other receiver top 25 last year who had fewer yards per target than him was Devontae Adams. Listen, there's no reason he can't repeat that kind of performance, like you said. I think he's got a great floor, but yeah, the ceiling is definitely there. Nobody in front of him scored, fewer touchdowns than he did. If he scores just 2 or 3 more, he moves himself up. So
no, that's fair.
And we don't have the plays in front of it, but Pittman was 9th in red zone targets. He had 19. He caught 14 of them. So is this a situation where he was getting to the 2-yard line? Okay, we're going to give it to Zach Moss, Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah. No,
That's what it seems like.
He was the DeAndre Swift of wide receivers getting tackled at the 1. Let's talk about the Houston Texan wide receivers. You want to talk about a situation that people are dying to try to figure out how they feel about it. So there's 2 ways we can go about this, and we're going to ask both those questions. One way is going to be which one do you want at cost, and the other way is going to be which one do you think is going to actually perform the best by the end of the season. I'm going to go to Adam here first. Adam, when you look at the Texans receivers, which one do you want at cost and why?
Dell is the one at cost that I want the most. No, I'll say that looking at both ECR and my rankings, I also have, Diggs higher than ECR. So I guess I would want him at cost as well. But for me, Dell is the guy that I'm most excited about going ahead and getting. Look, I think he's super explosive. I think he can do a lot with the ball in his hands after the catch. I think he can go down the field. I just think there's a lot of things he does super well. And what's so unique about Tank Dell to me is for a guy that's, short, he's, 5, whatever, he's under 200 pounds. He still gets off the line of scrimmage really well. Like he actually can play through some contact to the line of scrimmage, which is super impressive for someone in his size, just being a technician off the line.
That's why I was playing the perimeter, surprisingly.
Yeah, exactly. So just that he's not pigeonholed as a slot receiver is so exciting. This is a group that you can actually interchange and move around, and there's a lot of fun things that, there's opportunities for with these receivers. So I'm excited with him, and I think he's just the one to me that has the most upside because he can do a lot of these things on his own. He doesn't necessarily need Stroud to put him in situations. He can actually just take a short pass and make the play himself.
Yeah, he's the only receiver of this group I actually have ranked ahead of ADP. I mean, he was slightly better than Nico Collins of the first 12 weeks when Collins was the only wide receiver 14 at that point. He was upper echelon in yards per out run at 2.36. His ADOT was ranked 14th at 14.3. He was a great contested catch receiver, as you kind of alluded to there, was 6. Ranked 6 as a contested catch receiver. Incredible when you talk about a guy of that size. So, Anthony, I'm going to ask you a separate question. Who do you think is the best receiver of this group? Who scores the most fantasy points? Let's put it that way.
I'm all in on Nico Collins. They paid him to be the wide receiver 1 of the future. They brought in Diggs as a rental. Like, they're not going to tell Nico Collins, hey, you're going to take a back seat to Stephon Diggs, and then once he's out of here next offseason, you're going to be the one again. No, Nico Collins will be the guy. Is there some injury concern with Nico Collins? Yes, he's missed time in each of his first 3 seasons, so, maybe you ding him for that. But when you look at the most complete receiver on this roster, like Diggs is getting older. He has a lot of wear and tear. I like Tank Dell, but, from A to Z, Nico Collins does everything right. He was a wide receiver 7 in fantasy points per game. Pretty good. He wasn't like a top 10 guy in red zone targets or deep targets, but he got the job done. When you look at yards per reception, he was 9th there, 3rd in yards per target. So I just like everything this guy does. And clearly he has a rapport with CJ Stroud.
Sure. Look, numbers across the board last year were incredible.
He only had 109 targets.
Well, and I was just about to point that out. You almost can't mention Nico Collins without also mentioning Brandon Ayuk for the same reason of they were insanely efficient last season, but at the same time, I have concerns about both of their ADPs because it's hard to be that efficient year over year with that little amount of volume. Like you said, only 106 targets, only a 23% team target share. Now you're going to throw Stephon Diggs into the mix. So I do worry about that a little bit because we're talking about a player who until last year, most of us had profiled as just a guy. He wasn't getting open at an incredible rate. He wasn't making big plays. The quarterback was definitely a different scenario. We're not discounting that in any kind of capacity here, but it's somebody who's taken a huge leap. And I just wonder if there's going to be massive potential for regression as a result to that. I don't know if you want to rebuttal to that.
A rebuttal to which part?
As far as maybe pushing back on Nico Collins being able to duplicate what he did last season with the addition of Stephon Diggs, with the needed to have that level of efficiency in order to do it.
Of course, when we're targeting these hyper, in recent memory, guys like Jalen Waddle a few years ago, he was one of the more efficient receivers in the NFL, and it kind of backfired to anybody who drafted him. I think I'm just more willing to take that risk because Waddle had to contend with Tyreek Hill, where I still believe Nico Collins is the alpha in this wide receiver room. So I'm banking on he'll out-target those other guys.
Yeah, I'm following the money. Can't necessarily argue. How about this guy, Christian Kirk? Christian to Chris. I like that. This is a guy, right? He's been the wide receiver one for Trevor Lawrence, essentially. I mean, he's a big reason why I was not big on Calvin Ridley. Thank you, Christian Kirk, because you made me realize he's going to be the safety blanket. That's what he has been. And when he was on the field, he did out-target Calvin slightly, but he did out-target Calvin Ridley even still. So when they add in guys like Brian Thomas, when they add in guys like Gabe Davis, I don't think his role is going to change very much. And it's another guy, kind of like Pittman. I don't know if people get excited about him because he doesn't have the huge upside ceiling, but I feel like you need a couple Christian Kirks on your team to make a championship run. That guy's going to give you a consistent floor. What do you make of him? You got him ranked at 27.
Yeah, I think, Danny, you're in the ballpark of the guys that you're looking for. These guys, you're maybe hoping for some more double-digit touchdown opportunities, but not likely. But you're seeing a lot of volume, consistently volume, week in, week out. The best thing about all those things that you just named about the receiver changing is that you have guys who actually fit better roles. Calvin Ridley was being used to stretch the field and clear out roles. I don't know why that was the case, but Christian Kirk now gets to be full-time slot receiver in this offense. Thomas will be on the outside, Gabe Davis on the other side. You'll be able to have Christian Kirk getting simpler one-on-one coverage in the slot. Trevor Lawrence has shown a propensity since college to love this with the slot receivers. So I think you put those things together. You have a guy who has got a solid floor, a guy who has still following the money because he's still getting paid $20 million. I know it seems like chump change nowadays for receivers, but still a pretty good penny. And I think overall, I think Evan Ingram was a guy who got a lot of targets last year. Might see a little regression because Christian Kirk's going to be more in that center of that field. So I think Christian Kirk is that guy that's that safe bet for that receiver 2, low receiver 3 option.
Yeah, remember, he had the 5 games cut short, which is a lot of where Evan Ingram's targets came from during that stretch. I want to jump right into Brian Thomas because we finally have our first showdown of the All right, Adam and Chase, you need to get ready here. Anthony's going to judge this debate, by the way. It's Brian Thomas. So the rookie explosive extraordinaire comes in. He comes to Jacksonville, drafted with the first round pick. He is, I would say, more so the replacement of Gabe Davis for Calvin Ridley here. So Adam, you got him at 43. Chase, you got him at 53. So we have a whole tier gap between the two of you. Chase, why don't you go ahead first and tell me why he's down at 53 for you?
Well, let me start by saying I really liked Brian Thomas in the draft, in our draft prep in the lead up. Remember, I had him ranked 4th among the wide receivers just after the big 3 there. And, I think that he can be a good fit in this offense, but he's still a rookie wide receiver. Okay. And last year, if he's going to make wide receiver 43, last year, wide receiver 43 on a points per game basis scored 9.6 points per game. Okay. There were 14 teams in the NFL, almost half the teams in the NFL who had 2 receivers that were over that. Right. So you have to be at least the number 2 receiver on your team to get that. Only 3 of those were rookies though. Tank Dell, Puka Nacua, and Addison in Minnesota. But how did those guys get there? First off, we already talked about Dell was Stroud's favorite guy. Nacua burst out of the scene, but he also played a significant portion of the year without their true number 1, Cooper Kupp. And Addison obviously played a ton of the year without Jefferson there. So he's already it's already kind of an uphill battle for him to get to the points necessary to make it all the way up to wide receiver 43. But here's my other thing about it. As much as I liked Brian Thomas, as much as I think he can run more routes and more varied routes than he did in college, he did not run a varied route tree at LSU. He was a slant curl go guy. Well, guess who else is a slant curl go guy? The other guy that they paid in free agency this season, Gabe Davis, and brought in. I just think that between the two of them, when they do the exact same thing, I don't know if either one of them gets enough work or takes this role over early enough necessarily. You kind of alluded to it, Dan, that you think that he's the replacement for Ridley. I don't know if he's the replacement right away for Ridley. And even if he is, I think that Davis takes away a lot of the same routes that he runs. So I just don't see him getting to a point where he gets enough points this season to make it all the way up to wide receiver 43. I love him in Dynasty. I'm taking him where I can because, like I said, I was high on him as a player. I just don't know in his rookie season in this environment right now with Gabe Davis there as well, if he can quite make it up to that level with the points that I'm seeing him score this year.
Okay. Adam, what's your rebuttal to that?
Yeah. So for me, when I hit this tier, I'm not necessarily worried about drafting, safe. I'm trying to go yard. When I'm talking about a wide receiver, 43, 45, this tier of guy, we're trying to, like I said, we're trying to go yard. So what I think is super interesting about Brian Thomas Jr., we just talked about Christian Kirk. So let's get this one out of the way. Love Christian Kirk. Think he's a super talented wide receiver. Played over 13 games one time in his career. So odds are high. Brian Thomas Jr. is the wide receiver 1 for at least a handful of games this year. Like odds are pretty decent to that. I mean, I don't know if anyone here thinks Gabe Davis is anything other than just a guy. Not to say that he's not a guy with a similar skill set and NFL experience, like the whole thing. And not to say that he's outright bad, but that Brian Thomas Jr. has been drafted to be more than just a guy. Assuming Christian Kirk's injury isn't early in the season, Brian Thomas Jr. should have at least some runway, to get there. I definitely think that he's going to surpass Gabe Davis quickly. And now, Chase, to your point, with the overlapping skill sets, could they eat into each other? Absolutely. Not, disagreeing with that. Just that I do think he'll pass him. Now, the other thing is to get someone this deep that is going to be an outside starter, likely the primary outside starter, again, has to pass Gabe Davis to do that, but I believe in his ability to do so, I think is pretty interesting. Then going back to last season, Trevor Lawrence was a bit more aggressive. Now, he was still one of the quickest time to throw quarterbacks in the league. Let's not, act like he was holding onto the ball long, trying to go super deep all the time, but it was more so than previous years, trying to throw the ball down the field. And that was with Calvin Ridley, who we'll get to and my gripes with, but nonetheless, he was being misused like blatantly last season. They were trying to make him be this clear out deep threat wide receiver as an X, which he is almost none of those things. And because of that, his separation was awful. So they were more aggressive with him being an awful deep separator. And if there's one thing that I'm really confident Brian Thomas Jr. can do, I think he will develop as a route runner. I think he'll be really good at the contested catch guy. I'm really, really confident that he's going to separate down the field. That's the thing that I'm you can definitely do that. So I just think there's a lot of things that point not necessarily to guaranteed, consistent production, but there's so many avenues that the upside could come from, whether that's injury to Christian Kirk, whether that's, this offense decides to be a little bit more vertical with him. We haven't really seen that, with this staff here, but we've seen it in Philadelphia with them being a little bit more vertical, especially with the Super Bowl season. So I just think there's a lot of avenues for upside here. And again, I'm trying to go yard when we get into the 40s. And I think that there's a chance, if you told me he was wide receiver 60, I wouldn't really bat much of an eye. But also if you told me he finished the season at wide receiver 30, I think that's very within the realm of possibilities. So that's why I'm interested in Brian Thomas Jr. when we get to this tier.
Okay. All right. Anthony, you tell me which one you agree with more.
I think I agree with Adam more because I do see that variance in range of outcomes for Brian Thomas. What nobody brought up, when you look at this offense, this receiving core. Last year, it wasn't only Calvin Ridley they lost. They also lost Zay Jones. They were a top 10 team, and I believe passing yards and pass attempts. Where they weren't very good at is converting in the red zone and passing touchdowns. There's also the factor of Evan Ingram, who was one of the more higher targets. If not, he might have led all tight ends in targets last year. So there's definitely a lot of guys here. But if they're still throwing the ball at this high of a rate, it wouldn't surprise me if Brian Thomas, certainly edged out Gabe Davis. I was high on Gabe Davis, one of the highest few years ago. That blew up in my face. I think he's like the Mac Hollins or Zay Jones in this offense, where Brian Thomas was probably drafted to fill in that Ridley role.
Yeah, first of all, Anthony, we're not the only one who Gabe Davis blew up on. I was big on him too. And I want to point that out because no one mentioned that. Gabe Davis was clear-cut the number 2 receiver in Buffalo, but only earning a 14 to 19% target share during that time. I think it's easy Brian Thomas eclipsed that too. So that's just kind of one of 2 cents I wanted to throw in there. All right, Adam, you get the win on that one. We'll see if you can keep the streak alive because now we have another showdown between you and Chris, and this is a 2-for-1. So here's what we got. We got Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins. So first of all, the gap between Chris and Adam on Ridley is huge. Chris has him all the way up at wide receiver 24. Adam's got him down at wide receiver 39. But the twist is here, this is also going to be about DeAndre Hopkins because Adam has Hopkins ranked ahead of Calvin Ridley. So Chris is going to battle out as to why that should not be the case on his side. So Chris, take it up to Calvin Ridley, and then why is he ranked ahead of DeAndre Hopkins?
Well, I'll talk about the Calvin Ridley part. The DeAndre Hopkins and him, it's going to be a little harder for me to kind of argue strongly. But the Calvin Ridley thing is, look, Adam, I know you hate Calvin Ridley, and it's obvious you've hated him since last year, and you might be scoring lover in some kind of way. But you all admit Jacksonville utilized him in an improper way, didn't have a clue what they were doing. But he still finished receiver 17 last year. He still had 8 touchdowns, still had over 1,100 yards. So this guy who's such a bum, his first year back from being out of football for almost a couple of years, was able to produce at receiver 17, goes to a team that paid him $50 million guaranteed, is going to feature him as receiver 1 on that team. They keep talking about how they're going to give him the Jamar Chase role. They're going to move him around. They're going to utilize him in different ways to kind of get him the guy as a featured guy as their passing attack. So I look at Calvin Ridley as at 24. I think he's definitely receiver 2 as a guy who's going to have a lot of volume as passing attack. And I a little bit like the coaching staff in general. I didn't get to comment much about the running backs and Tony Pollard, who, guys, look, he was hurt going in, the year before last year. I keep hearing about the volume thing. I don't think it was a volume thing. I was hurt last year. Let's see what Tony Pollard is when he's healthy the whole season this year. But the offensive changing of guard that we've seen, and this has been Anthony highlighted earlier, bringing in Brian Callahan Sr. in for his offensive line is going to be huge. Now, add the fact that you actually have another talented lineman on this team. They brought in a good center in Kissenberry. So you have 3 linemen that actually could potentially decent versus what they've had in Tennessee for the last 3 or 4 years. It's been horrendous. And then you have a guy who was around quarterbacks like Matthew Stafford, who had his best year with him in Detroit. He was with Peyton Manning when he had his 4 of his best years in Denver. He was with Derek Carr when he had his best year in the Raiders. So now he goes to Will Levis. Is Will Levis the same level as all those guys? No, but we all agree Will Levis has been in position to be, this is your team, and you're going to throw the ball to everybody you want to. So a guy who got paid a lot with a guy who we know that Will Levis loves. Now, this is where I have a hard time, Adam, DeAndre Hopkins over or under Calvin Ridley, Dan. That's harder for me because we saw last year Will Levis is definitely willing to air it out. And he will throw that ball to DeAndre Hopkins come hell or high water. I think DeAndre Hopkins will be that red zone target guy who they're going to look for, a la the T. Higgins role, in a sense. So I do think DeAndre Hopkins still has a lot of upside. It's going to depend on where Calvin Ridley kind of connects with him, because I think Levis does prefer Hopkins right now. I mean, you saw that last year. That was the guy he was looking for consistently, but he didn't have a whole lot of choices. I do think the Hopkins can still be a guy that I have still in the top 30, because I think the volume is going to be there for both these guys. We've seen this, like I highlighted all those quarterbacks in those different offenses. All the second receiver, as Chase was talking about the different stats, all the second receivers in the offenses all had over 1,000 yards as well, and had over 6 or 7 touchdowns on average. So putting those things together, I think we could see both these guys be really successful. But I think Calvin Ridley to me is a guy that could not be receiver 39. Adam.
Yeah, I'm glad that I got to shed the AFC South bias with the last one where I was the higher end on a non-Colts player. So let me just get that out of the way. And second of all, I want to like Calvin Ridley. This has nothing to do with Calvin Ridley, the individual player. I admit going into last season, I wasn't in on him, but that was like, all right, I'm not taking the gamble on someone who missed the year. And then I admit during the season, I was like, I'm glad I didn't do that. He sucks, whatever. Come out of the season. And then I dug into it a little bit more. And Chris, exactly as you said, he was misused. That was not a Calvin Ridley problem. That was a Doug Peterson problem. 100%. So it's like, all right, cool. We get into the offseason. You're on the move. Where do you go? And that's where this falters to me. So I just see this offense shaping out in such a way that, look, part of it was the misuse. Part of it was the misuse. Part of it was the misuse. At the end of the day, Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins were both bottom 10 in separation. They were not getting away from corners. To me, who is Will Levis going to prioritize? It's the guy that he already has experience with, the guy that he's had an offseason with already. Cool, that's DeAndre Hopkins. So of the non-separators, I think it's going to be DeAndre Hopkins. It's the alpha. Now, if you disagree with that, then this entire argument falls apart right there. So I'm willing to throw that out there.
Adam, do you think Calvin Ridley's like a terrible route runner? Because the separation part's where you're bothering me. I think that's where the scheme thing does matter.
Yeah, I think it does. I think he's going to, regress to the mean in the sense that he makes it to maybe middle of the pack. But where I was going to get to is, do I think he separates more than Tyler Boyd, who I admit was on the downswing last year, but was one of still the top separators in the league? No, I don't think he passes Tyler Boyd. So we've got the guy that's normally open. We've got DeAndre Hopkins, who I'm pushing the ball to down the field. To me, can Will Levis support a third guy? I'm not sure of that. And it especially comes with the piece of, while I agree this offensive line with Callahan coming in and with the talent is on the upswing, we're talking one offseason with one confirmed good offensive lineman and two guys who are very, very talented and I think in the future are going to be very good offensive linemen. Let's call it a spade a spade. Skoronski was average last year. Like, average. Not bad. Average. He was not great last year. Do I think he will be an above average to great offensive lineman in the future? Absolutely. But am I like super sold on the fact that one offseason with a good coach is going to change that? I'm like, again, once we get 2 off seasons, 3 off seasons, sure, like 100%. Same thing with Latham. I loved him as a prospect. I might have been higher than a couple of you, at least when we were doing our pre-draft. Like, he was my offensive tackle 3. He was pretty close to my offensive tackle 2. Like, I really like Latham. So this isn't like me disliking Latham. It's just the fact that he is a rookie left tackle for a quarterback that holds onto the ball for too long, who is going to get really great coaching, but one off season of it. So on the whole, the build of this offense concerns me in the short term. And again, to me, Calvin Ridley, not necessarily that he's going to be the second option rather than the third option rather than the second, but I just think he overlaps a little bit too much with Hopkins, and I think Hopkins is the superior between them, whereas Boyd is off doing like something different, has a completely different role. So to me, Ridley isn't the bet that I'm willing to make.
All right, Anthony, a lot to unpack there. What do you got?
Yeah, it's close, but I think I side with Chris here.
Okay. That's it? No elaboration?
In terms of this wide receiver room, I feel like I went over it earlier. We were talking about Will Levis. I think both of these wide receivers, they're veterans. This is one of the oldest wide receiver rooms in the league. I believe they're all over 29 years old.
Yeah.
They're all going to have their role. I think we know what Boyd is at this point. When it comes to the two guys on the outside, the two alphas, I can see both of them, in terms of fantasy, having a very close finish, and they're probably going to cannibalize each other. So if there's not one I really like more than the other, I'm drafting Calvin Ridley higher, but I do think DeAndre Hopkins is going to be very much in this offense. Like, he's not going anywhere, and he's also worked with Will Levis a little bit longer.
Yeah, agreed. I agree with all of that. So we're gonna give Chris the win here, and I'll just throw this out there. That Anthony, what you just laid out is why I am lower than ADP on both Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, because I don't know if they can either one reach their ceilings by eating into each other. And we all know that I'm not a big fan of Will Levis, so I don't think he gets them both the ball as much as they need to outperform it.